Okay, I'd like to say hello and welcome everyone to the Localization Management Master Class preview webinar presented by Karen Combe and the Localization Institute. The purpose of our webinar today is to give you more information about what to expect in her four-part Localization Management Master Class. My name is Chris Wiegand. I work for the Localization Institute. I'll be monitoring the webinar today and handling any technical issues that come up. Before we start, I just have a few things to share with you. On one side of your screen, you will see a red arrow. Please click on that to show the control panel. You would want that open if you need to change your audio mode or if you have a question during the webinar. Otherwise, it's good to have that minimized so you can see Karen's screen. By default of GoToWebinar, all of you are muted except me and Karen, so we don't have any background noise to contend with. Questions are very welcome during the webinar. If you have one, please send it to me using the question pane in the control panel, and we will take questions and the answers at the end of the webinar. For the best audio and video quality, please close any other programs that you are using and remove any handheld devices, which can actually interfere with the audio quality of the seminar. I would now like to turn things over to our presenter, Karen Combe.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I think, to a few of you. Thanks very much for coming to this preview of the localization management seminars, which start a week from now. As you will know, we've divided this content into 4 modules, the first of which is the organization. And I would like to begin with a little story about my experience. I worked you'll know from my bio that I worked for 20 years for PTC, which is a large software company located in Boston. And I just left there actually at the end of March this year. But before that, I worked for 10 years for in International Language Engineering, which was a vendor company in Boulder, Colorado. And I was pretty early in ILE. I was, I think, the 12th employee. And I had the opportunity to do most jobs in the company, including desktop publishing, project management. I managed the production operation and eventually was the senior vice president in charge of sales and marketing. And with all that experience, I thought that I knew pretty much everything that was relevant about running localization and felt perfectly competent to advise our customers and prospects on how they should run localization within their companies. So I don't mean that I was hubristic, but I did feel as though I knew the business pretty well. Then I was recruited to PTC, and I discovered that I had a great deal to learn about running localization on the buyer side of the equation. The reason being that suddenly localization was not the most important thing. Now that might sound obvious, but once you're in that situation, you see that really the most important thing in the company is whatever it was set up to do. At PTC, the most important thing was building and selling software. And localization was considered to be a service in the company, to be accomplished as cheaply and efficiently as possible with high quality and not bothering anybody too much. So that's a very different kind of way to try to structure and run an organization. And it means that you as the localization manager are in competition with those organizations that are creating the product for resources. And so part of your job in building your organization or managing the organization that you inherit is justifying those resources and defending them when necessary. I had a manager one time who said that it was very important to not allow people to think of localization as a piggy bank. That is to say, when costs needed to be cut, we didn't want them coming to knock on our door to try to find ways that we could do our work more cheaply. Of course, everybody's subject to that sort of thing at one time or another, but but we didn't want to be too much in that position. Another thing that we used to think on the vendor side, particularly as project managers, was that if we could just get to the buyer side, we would have some power. We always felt as though we were at the mercy of our customers. That is to say, they could make what we considered to be perfectly unreasonable demands on us in terms of schedules or cutting costs to an extent that our margins were impacted. And although we could, of course, push back to a certain extent, we were expected to be able to get the job done to keep those customers. And I think the industry has changed a little bit now, of course, but at that time we really were without a lot of opportunity to push back. And so we thought, well, if we could just get to the buyer side, we would have power. And then, of course, having got to the buyer side, I discovered that in fact the position is not one of power, but a very different point of view. Now, this might sound a little bit unattractive as a job, but I assure you that there are tremendous opportunities and challenges to be met to expand your skills and capabilities. So we'll talk in the first session about the kind of organization that you might either inherit or set up, and what the pros and cons of the different possibilities are, and what you might want to aim at in terms of an optimized organization. And then from there, we will move into the business of localization. Now, the company thinks of localization as a service. And as such, as I said, it should be done, as cheaply and easily as possible. But if you think about how CEOs talk about their companies, what they talk about, certainly they talk about the importance of their employees, and they talk about the importance of their customers. But what's important to them is the numbers. What are the revenue numbers? What are the costs? What's the free cash flow in the system? What's their profitability? How can they optimize all of those different factors? And that's how they manage the business. That's how they manage the whole company. Well, you would be well served as the manager of localization to think about your operation in the same way. How can it be optimized in terms of costs and linked to the business and the revenues of the company? This allows you, if you operate this way, and if you present yourself this way to the rest of the company, this allows you to be more integrated into the business of the company and how you can contribute to the success of the company. So this allows you eventually to be taken out of just a service and more thoroughly incorporated into the business. Now, this means that you have to look at numbers and think about how to optimize your operations. And that doesn't mean, you're just going to machine translate everything and be really cheap and really fast, because as we know, that's not necessarily going to get you quality that will keep your customers. But to think about optimization in terms of the balance of how you do things, and the balance of how you do things in-house versus with vendors. So taking this approach as a business allows you to participate in the success of the company to a more visible degree. And that's a way to enhance the value of what you do in your company. From there, we will move on to technology. And I'm sure that all of you on this call know something about the technology in the localization industry, starting with translation memory. So translation memory technology has been around since the 90s, when it was the big new thing. And at that time, there was actually a sort of marvelous thing that happened in the industry, which was that everybody agreed essentially on how translation would be paid for using translation memory. That is to say, everybody agreed that new words would be paid for in one way, and various levels of fuzzy matching would be paid for at different rates. Now, there could be certainly a lot of discussion on the amounts that were paid for each of those categories, but everybody pretty much agreed that those would be that there would be these categories, and that's how it would be paid for. And all we had to do was count the words in all of the categories, and there could be really very little argument over that kind of thing. Now that's changing to some degree now, and people are starting to talk about paying for translation hourly, no matter what technology is used. And so there's a lot to be considered in that respect. But also, now we have machine translation. And as I'm sure you know, machine translation is getting better and better all the time. In fact, I heard Chris Wendt, who runs the machine translation organization at Microsoft, say a year or so ago that their machine translation engines for French and Spanish had reached human parity in terms of the results of the machine translation. And I've heard people say similar things for Portuguese, for example. So now you have to consider, and people are talking about, well, is translation memory still useful to us? Is this still a technology that we need to pay attention to buy and own and get people to use? Or should we just use machine translation? Now, obviously, how you do translation depends a lot on the type of content that you're working with. Obviously, marketing is going to be somewhat different from technical documentation, for example, or tech support knowledge base articles. But you need, as the manager of localization, to understand those technologies well enough to be able to make a judgment about what you should do, whether you do that in-house or whether your vendors do it on your behalf. So you have to have at least that level of knowledge. And the other thing to think about, very importantly these days, is automation. So we're finding that there is more and more automation in our localization processes, having to do with fetching content from various different repositories, getting it to the people or technologies that translate it back into the technologies, back into the repositories, and how to maintain quality in that kind of situation, and who's going to do the work, who's going to establish those technologies on your behalf, whether you're going to outsource that, whether you're going to persuade some other group within your company to do it, how exactly that will be done. So that's an important sort of relatively recent innovation in the industry, as well as innovation, as well as automation in testing. So most companies who do, for example, software development also have increased the amount of automation in their software testing processes. And so there's a question of how much those technologies can be incorporated into the localization process, at least insofar as some parts of the testing that you do are concerned. So these are all important considerations for you as the manager of localization, and we'll discuss them in terms of how you get them done and what decisions you need to make. And then finally, we'll move on to relationship management. Now, sometimes when I was at PTC, people in my department would come to me and say, oh, I met with so-and-so today and we discussed this or that aspect of localization that we're thinking about. And I would say, well, what's that person's position? Or what department is that person in? And sometimes they would say, I'm not sure. I think maybe it was IT, but it could have been this other department. I don't know. And so then I would say, okay, so we need to know what department they're in and whom do they report to? Where are they in the hierarchy? Because Going back to what we were saying earlier about how to make localization be seen as more of a critical function rather than just a service, it's important to know who in the organization you might need to know and be able to influence, and what the chain of command is. So we had a practice in my department, at least, that everybody needed to be very familiar with the address book and know whom they were talking to and what they might be able to accomplish with that person, and if they needed to, if and when they needed to move up the chain in the hierarchy in order to get something done. Now, there are certain relationships that localization people have sort of by default. So those are the people from whom we receive content to localize, whether it's marketing, whether it's the writers who write the technical documentation, whether it's developers who write software strings. We have to have a relationship with those people because we take their content, and we want those processes of getting the content and then pushing it back to go smoothly and seamlessly. So that's not going to happen unless we have smooth and seamless relationships with those teams, even more than with people, with those teams. So those are relationships that need to be established and nourished and oftentimes extended. Also, as a localization professional, you do have the opportunity to interact with many different groups in your company, and that includes the executives. Eventually, the uh, the importance and the costs of localization are visible at the highest level in the company. If you're in a startup, for example, you might be sitting 2 or 3 chairs away from the CEO, and that's a somewhat different situation that we'll actually address in the sessions. But often the CEO is somebody that you've only seen from a distance. However, the fact of localization, the cost of localization, revenues associated with localization are visible at those high levels, and you may have the opportunity to influence those people. So we'll talk about what you might need to do in order to establish that influence. So we'll end up talking about relationships. And I think that's it, Chris, for what I wanted to say. I think people might have some questions.
Great, thank you, Karen. And again, please use your question pane in the control panel to type out any questions that you have for Karen. Karen, here's a question. Will you cover the roles needed in a localization department?
Yes, absolutely. When we talk about the organization, we will also cover the roles that will be needed and which ones you need to have in your team, which ones you might be able to outsource.
Okay. And here's a second question. Will the content include how to build an ROI for localizing?
Yes, that's a particularly interesting question, and we will definitely talk about it probably at some length. Yes, we will.
Okay.
We'll talk about that
Does any,
in the business section.
okay. Does anyone else have a question for Karen? Will this course be offered again later in the year or in 2021?
We hope so.
Mhm.
Yes, I think that's the plan. That if people want to learn this material, then yes, we will offer it again.
Okay. On the topic of roles, will you talk about the career paths available in the localization industry?
Yes, that's a very interesting topic, and we will talk about it. Yes, I think that's the short answer.
Alrighty. I'm wondering if
But
the
oh, sorry,
primary
sorry,
audience,
sorry, sorry, Chris. Related to that, um, we'll talk about roles that are similar to roles in localization, because they're sometimes, especially in a buyer organization, uh, you hit a ceiling in terms of your role, and you want to think about, well, what if I wanted to reach a higher level or do something slightly different. So we'll talk about similarities between roles in localization and other roles inside your company or a company
Okay.
and what you might be able to do.
Okay, next question. I'm wondering if the primary audience is more an entry-level PM, or will you go into detail for how to set up COE for large organizations where you standardize processes and job descriptions?
I hadn't actually thought about that. Well, definitely. I mean, since I come from a relatively large organization, I'm certainly concerned about that. So I would say that we're going to touch on startups and what you need to do or what you might be able to do in a startup, um, but also including larger organizations. And I should say that, I have my own personal experience, of course, but I've been pretty active in the industry for all of these years, and I am in regular contact with my peers in the industry who run localization in IT companies and other different kinds of companies. We meet regularly. We talk about our mutual challenges and how we run our operations. So I'm certainly very familiar with what other people might need to do in their companies as well, and I can share some of that kind of information.
But how will the interactivity work? Does that mean more people sharing experiences or asking questions? On that last question of if audience would be newer or experienced localizers.
I'm sorry, Chris, I didn't hear the beginning of that question.
Mhm. How will the interactivity work?
Oh, I
I think
see.
she
Okay,
means, is
so
this going to be people sharing or asking questions of you?
um, I think it's probably going to be a little bit of both, frankly. I mean, each session is an hour, so we have, some limitation. But I would expect for people to ask questions, and I would expect also for people to share their experience to some extent. You know, although now after 30 years, I think I know a lot more than I did when I started. I don't think that I know everything. So we can certainly learn from each other, and that's one of the huge benefits of the interactions that we have in the industry. So yes, I would assume that we'll have some that level of activity.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what depth of programming knowledge is required for localization managers in IT?
I don't think any level of programming ability is necessary for managing localization. Um, you certainly need to know about what's used and done in your organization, and you have to have access to engineering knowledge about what's relevant in programming. But you don't necessarily have to know it yourself as a manager. You, as a manager, it's sort of like what you learn at university. You get a lot of knowledge at university, but one of the main things that you learn is how to learn and how to get information. And so as a manager, what you need to know is how to get information and what people you need to have on your team in order to optimize that knowledge and make use of that knowledge. So you don't
Okay,
have to know everything yourself. I would say actually it's not a bad idea to have taken some sort of basic programming course just to understand what people talk about, what development talks about. You pick that up over time, but it's not a bad thing to know going in.
okay. Will you cover transcreation?
We can certainly talk about transcreation. That's a very interesting topic, and we will touch on uh, marketing because a lot of localization departments work with or for a marketing department, which is a very particular kind of interaction. and transcreation is something that we'll address in that environment.
Okay. And it looks like this is our last question. Did you outsource localization quality management in your organization? And if yes, was it successful?
Outsource quality management. Well, in the sense that we outsourced translation, we outsourced the management of the quality of that translation because the vendors were responsible for the quality that they provided to us. However, at PTC, we were very fortunate to have some in-house translators. We had one per language that we supported. And so our in-house translators, being very familiar with our products, and as the ones who established the localized terminology, served also as quality assurance on work that our partners did for us. So there are definitely companies, peers that I know, who have methodologies for outsourcing quality assurance, and it works quite well for them. But I have not done that myself.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any other questions from the audience, so I think we've reached the end of our webinar today. The masterclass starts at this same time next Thursday. There will be 4 sessions, 4 one-hour sessions, plus an additional session about 1 month after conclusion of the class. The class is limited to somewhere between 15, 18 attendees, and there are just 10 spots left open. So if you want to attend the class, please register soon. On behalf of Karen Coleman, Localization Institute, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
Karen.
Bye bye.
Bye.